Well, good morning, colleagues. A warm welcome to Lee Dillon, who returns as our guest member on this committee. Lee, you're welcome. Thank you for coming back. And an even warmer welcome to our witnesses this morning. We have two panels today. We're going to kick off with the Royal Mail. Gentlemen, I'll ask you to introduce yourself in a moment. But first, I'm just going to ask colleagues if anybody has any declarations of interest. Michelle.
Yeah, just for complete transparency, my father did work for the Royal Mail for about 30 years, but he's been retired for quite a while now, but he does receive a pension, and the Communication Workers Union did donate to my election campaign.
Lauren?
I worked for the Communication Workers Union for 3 years as lead postal researcher, and also got a donation from them for the last general election.
Very good. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Thank you. Well, the Royal Mail, as we know, is the key element, really, one of the key ingredients to delivering a successful election. Candidates being one, obviously, but without the Royal Mail, it would all be very much more difficult. So, gentlemen, can I just ask you to introduce yourself with your roles, and then I will open the floor to questions.
Good morning. I'm David Gold. I'm Director of External Affairs and Policy at Royal Mail.
Good morning, everyone. I'm McAulay. I'm the Operations Director at Royal Mail.
Thank you, gentlemen. You're very welcome. Richard Quigley.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome. Now, not wanting to set the conspiracy theory horses bolting, because that's never a good way to start a Tuesday morning, but you said that you delivered a record number of poll cards, 50.8 million poll cards, but we've only got 48.2 million eligible electors, and I'm sure there's a very sensible explanation, but can you clear up where the extra 2.6 million polling cards came from?
Well, thank you firstly for that question, Mr. Quigley. I can only go by the number that we received from local authorities. They provide us with a work plan so that we know how many we are to expect, and then we can monitor what comes in and what actually goes back out. I could speculate that possibly there were some replacement poll cards, possibly people registering for postal votes after the start of the election campaign, but as I say, that's purely speculation.
And are you concerned? I mean, I know it's 5%. Would something like somebody that's died that was registered, would that affect it? Because it's quite, 5% is quite a large margin of error in terms of sending out polling cards. I
confess I've not really given that any thought, so it could be, but I imagine that local authorities might be better placed to answer that question more accurately.
Thank
you. We may turn to that on our second panel as well, as they're the ones in charge of the register. Did you have any further questions, Richard, on that? Or
no, that's fine.
Okay, Lee Dillon.
Thank you. Morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
I'm guesting from the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, where the policy for elections sits as a scrutiny function from that main department. So just a couple of questions on postal vote pack distribution. So first of all, how many postal vote packs were delayed in the Royal Mail system, either being delivered to the voter or being returned to the returning officers at the general election?
I'll take that one. We're not aware of any postal votes being delayed in our network. Just to be clear and to give some context, Royal Mail is exceptionally proud of the role that we play in supporting democracy in the nation. A general election, every election for that matter, for Royal Mail is a significant event. We stand up dedicated teams, and I would like to put on record a huge thanks to 130,000 postmen and postwomen, all of our managers, that dedicated team that we believe played a critical role in the 2024 general election. So election mail's highly visible in our network, so every envelope, you probably recognise these, but they carry a purple stripe.
Well, like Valerie Singleton, here's one I've prepared earlier.
Yes.
We came prepared.
There's
Hopefully
two that
that's
never
okay.
made it back.
Yeah.
That's two.
But the nature of ballot packs and postal votes is that they're highly automated, so they go through our automation with great efficiency. They're also very visible, so if they come out the automated stream on our preparation fittings and our delivery units, they can be seen. As I say, there's a huge communications effort in Royal Mail, because we know the part we play it's important to Royal Mail, but it's important to our country as well. One of the why do I say what I say? On the final day, on polling day, we do something called a final day sweep. So we will sweep every one of our 1,200 delivery units, all of our 37 mail centres. So even on the final day, and we've got around 115,000 post boxes, those post boxes will be cleared, and those collections will come into our 37 mail centres. And it's a massive event that last day. We're very proud of the fact we recovered 70,000 postal votes on that last day, got them to returning officers. That actually was delivered ahead of the first class service that we would normally deliver. So that's the final day extraction. But listen, we sit as part of a wider supply chain overall, so we're dependent on other people supplying into the network. We, in our written correspondence ahead of the committee today, have suggested some areas for improvement overall, but I would like to assure the committee that we weren't sitting on top of delay in the Royal Mail network, and we have a significant focus in making sure that we fulfil the part that we play in that supply chain.
Mr. McAulay, just for the record, you might just want to put on the record what you think those improvements may or could be, and it might just be helpful to the committee if you could almost do the sort of narrative of a day in the life of a postal vote. It leaves the council office as a pack. How many sort of eyes and hands are on it before it goes back to the returning officer? Just to give us a flavour of the depth of the complexity, that might just be helpful to all of us.
So local authorities will typically appoint printers to produce the outbound ballot packs once they've been ordered, and last year people were able to opt for a postal vote up until the 19th of June. Pre-registered postal voters come into the system much earlier, a week to 10 days earlier, which is great. The 19th of June is the last date people can order a postal vote. So to the printers, we're constantly in touch with the local authorities and the printers. And why do we do that? We get a mailing plan from them, so we can make sure they have York containers, so our containers, our trays, and collections are placed at the time they're ready to dispatch into the network. Then those ballot packs are processed through the Royal Mail network, so in the outbound leg, so going to the recipient through the network in the normal way, another first-class item would be delivered through the network. But on the return postal vote, they're typically a local item, because normally somebody returning a postal vote is within their own constituency, normally, not always, but normally. So it's a very local network. And the one reason I can say sure we didn't have delay is that when it comes to that final return of a postal vote, we're not trying to deliver to 32 million addresses around the country like a normal first-class item. We're delivering to 361 returning officers, most of which have a time delivery product, and there's huge focus in getting those back every day. And trust me, if we don't, there'll be an inquiry straight away. So, it's a more simplified network than a normal first-class item travelling through the network, given the fact there's 361 returning officers that we are delivering to on a daily basis. We're not trying to get to 32 million addresses.
Mr. Dillon.
Yeah, thank you. So, as a company, I think your delivery targets over the last couple of years have been just under 75% against your target of 93% for first-class deliveries. So, are you confident, given that localised delivery network that you were saying, that all postal ballots were delivered over and above your standard operational target for the country as a whole?
Yeah, I don't think it would be representative to user general quality of service for the reasons I've just outlined as a proxy for our performance on elections. The fact we delivered to 361 addresses in the return leg, and we're not trying to deliver to 32 million addresses 6 days a week, is quite a different operation. And as I've said, both the focus we place in it, from the Chief Operations Officer all the way through the organisation, and a daily cadence of multiple calls a day in terms of staying on top of the whole supply chain, through to the fact that it can be machine sorted, it's highly visible in our network, that's why it carries the purple identifier. I'm very confident that what was in our network in the lead up to polling day and on polling day with that final day sweep would have been flushed through.
And then just the final one from me, Chair, is do you keep separate statistics on election material?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, David.
Yes, we do. Primarily because we are accountable to the customer, in this case the government, for every item and the charging of every item. And not only that, but we have to be able to prove the quality of service on that. But if I may, Mr Dillon, I know you asked, Chair, about improvements that might be made to the elections timetable. Very briefly, in our letter we set out that the timeline between the final date for registering for a postal vote and polling day itself is incredibly short. And with the best will in the world, and despite the heroic performance of our people, I think it's probably indisputable now, and I know the Electoral Commission gave evidence to you a couple of weeks ago, that that timeline perhaps needs to be revised to give everybody confidence that if they require a postal vote, it's got a reasonable chance of not only getting to them, but enough time for it to get back to the returning officer. A couple of other points, if I may, Chair, that at the moment, if somebody doesn't receive their postal vote for whatever reason, local authorities can only offer them an alternative, a replacement postal vote, no less than 4 days before polling day. If you've required a postal vote because you're going on holiday, I imagine that probably doesn't seem long enough. I think also there is a misconception, a misunderstanding among the public that if you perhaps register for a postal vote the day after the election is called, in your mind you might reasonably assume that that postal vote is going through the system and will reach you fairly swiftly. Actually, postal votes are only sent out in 2 batches at the moment, as I'm sure you know. For us, it would be incredibly helpful if those postal votes could be released as the people require them. I think something like 1.2 million registered for a postal vote after the election was called, which must have put enormous pressure on the whole system. But we're the last part in the chain, and for us, it would just give us that bit more time. And I think if people understood when to expect their postal vote, it might also improve their faith in the system.
Government is effectively your customer. But do you share with the local authorities at the end of every electoral period a sort of key learning, best practice, lessons to learn, tiger traps not to fall into? So it's an iterative, organic process.
We've actually conducted a couple of workshops already with more than 20 local authorities. I had the pleasure of going to ones in Leeds and Sheffield, where they were held at our mail centres so that the local authority officers could actually see the process for themselves. It was very helpful to be able to share, you know, the things that went well, but also to reflect on the things that could be improved. And I'm sure that as we go forward, not only looking at the Electoral Commission's report, but also the report from this committee, we will continue to look at how we did. I don't think anybody would ever claim that you can be 100% perfect, so there's always room for improvement.
Do you produce a sort of online, downloadable, to be, well, you might as well generate some business, you might as well mail it out, a sort of how you, as the local authority, can help us, i.e. the Royal Mail, make sure you deliver the best election possible, the do's and the don'ts?
Yes, there is a written specification for how we work together. It may be helpful to the committee, and I'm sure you all know this, that elections take place throughout the year, every year, because of by-elections and so on. And of course, you know, the annual elections that take place at various points. So we have a dedicated elections team that works all year round, and we interact with local authorities all year round. And as we go, obviously, if we identify things that can be improved, we do so. So I wouldn't want anybody to think that this is just a once in every 4 or 5 years occasion.
Thank you. John Lamb.
Sorry,
I'm sorry,
sorry,
Mr. Dillon, forgive me.
Sorry, Mr. Gould, you said yes, you do keep statistics on election material. Could you write to the committee with what those statistics are and what the performance against those were? Or if the chair's willing to hear those now?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. I think we may have written some in our submission to you in advance of this hearing. But it is, you know, just for the record, over 250 million items were delivered in relation to the election in a very short space of time. And again, I'd like to reiterate what Ricky said. I take my hat off to everybody who was involved.
Did having elections in May and then an election in July put additional strains on the system?
I think Ricky would probably be a better place to answer that.
I think the fact in Scotland that fell into the first week of holidays is more a question for turnout. When it comes to our leave planning, we plan our leave well in advance. For every 7 postmen and postwomen, we've got a permanently recruited, trained annual leave reserve, we call them. So they're pre-planned in to cover leave. So I think it's more a question for turnout than it is Royal Mail's ability to respond to the election. You know, we've got all the historical data. We get good advance notice of mailing plans from the print partners, and we flex our network to accommodate that, and we have done during every previous election as well, successfully.
I think anecdotally, Chair, I picked up quite a sense from colleagues that having just been through the local elections, which of course weren't in every part of the country, but I think within the organisation there was a sort of psychological feeling of, oh good, well we know how to do this, we've just done it, so let's do it again.
It was oh good rather than oh God.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's encouraging to hear. Yeah. Good. Mr. Lamond.
Thank you, Chair. Can I start just by echoing your comments about your posties? I cover 9 sorting offices in my constituency, and they did a tremendous job getting all the stuff that we were asking them to deliver through the doors. But there were delays in Scotland. Your evidence highlighted some issues with the printers. Can you expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so listen, for all of the printers and via the local authorities, we have a mailing plan. So we have scheduled collection times from printers. The printers for Scotland specifically impacting postal votes during Fife and Edinburgh City. We were due to collect those on the 26th of June, so this was in the second batch, not the pre-registered voters in Scotland. These are people that registered for a postal vote after the election had been called. And when we went to collect the postal votes, they weren't available from a printer in the Nottingham area, which we escalated very quickly. We established collections as they were required by the printer, so we then went back on the Thursday. Again, the postal votes weren't available in line with the mailing plan. We went back again on Friday. And rather than letting those postal votes come through our network in the normal way, we put on dedicated collection services all the way into Scotland so we could get those out in delivery on the Saturday before polling day, the following Thursday. So actually, if you look at the comment from the Electoral Management Board in Scotland, they said Royal Mail's role in recovering that situation was exemplary. And I'm very proud of what we've done there, both in identifying and working with the supply chain. And there are issues in the supply chain to get those postal votes delivered on the Saturday. And we put in some special monitoring on the Saturday, and we said 98% were delivered, and this is unit by unit confirmation on the Saturday, and the remainder on the Monday.
Just for the benefit of the committee, the failure was clearly with the printer, so they were contractually not fulfilling their side of the obligation to the Scottish Government, who is the management board in Scotland. It's a separate board in Scotland, isn't it, in terms of the election management team?
It would be the local authorities that would appoint the printers. David, you'd be probably...
To be honest, I'm not directly involved, so I don't know where the contractual obligation is, but certainly my understanding would be, Mr Lamont, that yes, the printer delay would have been a contractual issue.
Okay. There was other examples, though, which I think were Royal Mail's responsibility. So in my own constituency and others in Scotland, there was, for example, examples of posties who were on holiday for particular weeks. And rather than putting on alternative cover to ensure that postal votes were being delivered during that critical week, the postal votes were remaining at the sorting office until that postman or woman returned from holiday. Were there any other examples or were you aware of cases like that, or was that not supposed to be happening?
No. And I listened to the evidence session on the 7th, Mr Lamont, and we have since kind of followed up, and I don't recognise that delay in the sorting office you're referring to. And I'm not saying Royal Mail is perfect, but you know, we've always got scope, the same as the rest of the supply chain, to improve. But if we can't cover a delivery one day because of an absence, our standard operating procedure is always to have somebody on that route the next day. So a maximum of 1 day's delay. And if an inquiry had been raised at the time, we would certainly have looked into that. But I don't recognise a delay, a route not being covered for a week. Our internal controls, certainly the focus that I've got daily, and not just during the period of election, but trying to improve quality of service all the time, wouldn't allow that to go for a week uncovered.
And the other experience that we had as a political party, I mean, obviously the government is a major customer of the Royal Mail during the election, but the other major customer you have is all of the political parties. In previous elections, we have various phased communications that go out to electors when postal votes land and at various other points during the election campaign. And our experience during this campaign was we could not rely on Royal Mail to deliver phased communications. Indeed, there was a number of examples of electors receiving bulk communications after the election was over from all the different parties, despite the fact it was posted 2-3 weeks prior to that. Postal vote communications being the most obvious example, which were landing like 2 weeks before polling day, not arriving until after the election actually completed. And electors getting in touch with us to say, why are you writing to me after the election is over? Good question. Are you confident that the service you were previously able to offer to political parties in terms of phased communication during the campaign is as good as it used to be?
Perhaps I could answer that, Mr Lamont. I took the liberty of checking our statistics from the election on the delivery of candidate mail. From memory, there were 184 million items of what we call candidate mail, which is the election address from candidates. To the best of my knowledge, we delivered those within a margin of error of 0.2%. So 0.2% didn't arrive within the intended schedule. Now, I would not for one moment suggest that there weren't errors or that some regrettably arrived after polling day.
Forgive me, I'm not talking about official election communications. Obviously, I'm concerned about them as well. I'm talking about additional communications, like, for example, a letter I might be writing to somebody who I know is going to be supporting me, but it's not framed as an election communication. It's just a letter in the same way as anybody else would want to post a letter to a third party, which has been caught up in the system and not arriving within the time period that we expected.
I am aware that it's a very stressful time for candidates, and I know that there is a lot of thought and planning goes into certain communications landing at certain points in the election timetable. I know from having dealt with a number of those cases in the time that there were some issues, but I think on investigation, some of those issues weren't entirely down to Royal Mail. I think there was on a number of occasions a disconnect between the understanding of a candidate as to when a mailing would be landing and when perhaps the printer or the central party organisation had actually placed the order.
I don't want to have any more questions on this, but what I would say, I've been fighting elections since 2005. I've never known a campaign which has been so difficult in terms of ensuring the Royal Mail was delivering communications in the window that we expected, both as a candidate and as a political party. This was by far the most challenging campaign for that.
I'll take that back as feedback.
Richard Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Just briefly, that there were particular issues in Edinburgh City and Fife in terms of delivery of postal votes, and as MP for Fife, I'm very conscious of that. On the day of the election, some people still hadn't received their postal votes. You've helpfully provided us a very clear case study of the problems with the contract for printing. And the Election Management Board have rightly praised your response, but presumably, from your perspective, you'd want the somewhat more resilience in the contract arranged by the Electoral Management Board for Scotland in terms of the printing of the postal votes. It does seem to me fairly extraordinary that because a printer broke down in terms of that contract, there was such a shambles resulting, and some people actually were denied their democratic vote because of the failure to have a robust and resilient supply chain for the printing of those votes.
I think one of the recommendations that we have put forward, I think, would help, and that is for the printers to move away from a batching of that second wave of postal votes to dispatching them into the Royal Mail network on a daily basis, so that we have a continuous flow of the delivery of postal votes. In holding it and batching it, you're already building in somewhere in the region of a 7 to 8 day delay that is completely unnecessary. And clearly the risk of a breakdown, as you're referring to, is heightened when you're batch processing like that. So actually continuous processing is a recommendation we've made, and we're happy to work with the supply chain to really make the point and to bring that to life.
I think there's a very good recommendations, but clearly I'm sure you'll agree that it's also important for those responsibility for these issues within Scotland to ensure also their supply chain and their contractors can provide in terms of the contracts are expected to ensure the election can be run smoothly, particularly in a situation where many people are on holiday in Scotland.
Great.
Luke Taylor.
Just to explore that issue in a little bit more detail, because I'm sure it wasn't just, or in this occasion, it wasn't just affecting Scottish votes, but also when we're looking at local elections coming up, there may well be similar issues. Was the delay at the Nottingham plant or the Nottingham printers due to a machinery failure, or was it due to challenges with data from local authorities? It sounds like it was machinery failure with then the procedures they had to build up a batch and then do it all at once. So looking at how we manage contracts in the future, would the change to the system that you explain mitigate a potential machinery failure?
I think it would be for the printers to answer as to what exactly went wrong. All we know is that when we turned up to take the delivery of the items, they weren't available. I think to your question about whether the resilience would be improved by the change we've requested, one would hope so. I think what is really important is that everybody who registers to vote, whether they register to vote in person or by post, knows that they're going to be able to, and that their vote is going to then be counted towards the ultimate result. I think it's as important that whoever takes part in the election, whether they win or lose, has faith in the result, and that means that every vote must surely be counted.
Okay. Laura Edwards.
Thank you. Like a lot of MPs, I visited my mail centre in the lead up to Christmas and saw a really efficient operation and lots of hard-working staff and management, which was great. But I do, like a lot of MPs, have some issues around constituents reporting non-delivery of post, largely in the Strood area in my constituency. And that visit was quite useful in identifying that was mainly an issue at the local delivery office in terms of staff sickness and also recruitment challenges. And I'm just wondering, given that you are dealing with those challenges in your business as usual environment, can you talk us through the additional pressures that elections place on you, and particularly this last general election that we've just had?
perhaps Ricky would like to cover from an operational perspective, but from a sort of aerial perspective, perhaps I can just reiterate that when we talk about the importance of elections, the Chair asked earlier to describe a day in the life of. The moment the election was called, from the very top of the organisation to the roots of the organisation, there was an ethos of, we're going to make this really brilliant. And the Chief Operations Officer every day chaired a national call where information was coming in from every delivery office, every mail centre, every part of the operation. And where any issues were identified, whether that is a high level of absence among staff or resourcing issues, they were dealt with in real time. And I think that coupled with the fact that on a daily basis we had an internal communications drumbeat to remind everybody not just of the process of how everything is meant to work, but also the role we were playing in delivering a national democratic election, meant that everybody, from the postie on the ground in your constituency to me sitting in the office, possibly talking to officials in government about how everything was going, we all felt we were part of a national effort to make sure that, that this election was delivered well. But in terms of the pressures, I think, Ricky, you would know better than me.
Yeah, as I said earlier, we do get advance notice, so in terms of the timeline, it's not completely sprung in Royal Mail. We'll get well-rehearsed plans for general elections. So the mailing plans from the printers are important for poll cards, ballot packs, and return postal votes. Ultimately, they come through our network, and we've got all the historic trends of where they land and at what rate they typically come back through the network. So we can plan to that. But you're quite right in saying that some of the delivery units might have more of an acute issue. But our reporting, our transparency in reporting, and certainly within operations, our kind of mantra is if we don't know it's a problem, we can't help you fix it. So, you know, we demand a high level of transparency of issues. During the election, we might dispatch a fix-it team to a local delivery unit that's potentially got issues. It's something we do at Christmas. We have around 5,000 managers. A few thousand managers don't work directly in the operation, and at Christmas they'll go into the operation. And likewise, if we have delivery units that are showing signs of distress or not, as Mr Lamont said, not covering the ground potentially every day, we say we need to get there next day. If they need some help with that, the call that Dave is referring to is about placing that support where we can. And our quality of service is improving this year compared to previous years. We've got a way to go, and we are in regular dialogue with Ofcom about what those improvement plans are as a regulator.
Do you know offhand how many of those fix-it teams needed to be dispatched during the general election?
I couldn't say off the top. But if it's of particular interest, we can provide it afterwards to the committee. But something I don't have it to hand, so
maybe you could write to the committee with the national picture.
Do that, Chair.
I think that would be useful. Thank you. And then just a final question. I'm certainly aware over the last decade, if not longer, your business has quite rightly pivoted towards parcels. It's the more profitable part of the business. How do you ensure that letters are not being sidelined or forgotten about, which obviously is particularly important during a general election, when you obviously face those kind of commercial challenges? How during a general election do you make sure that they're still prioritised?
Well, not just during a general election, but letters are still massively important to Royal Mail. We have been calling for some time, and this is a different committee, but to you for reform to the universal service, which I think there's now broad acceptance that there's a need for reform. But we used to handle around 2004 to 2005, the Royal Mail network, we carry about 20 billion letters a year. Last year, that number was 6.7 billion letters. And what I would say is we've shown resilience. We've delivered 5 general elections over that period of time where we went from 20 billion to 6.7 billion. And with universal service reform, and part of our proposal maintains a 6-day-a-week standard tariff across the whole of the UK next-day service, which clearly for postal votes and ballot packs are essentially important. But you know, we talk about letters all the time in terms of the importance to Royal Mail, and you know, we fight very, very hard to defend letters and you know, promote the use of letters in our network.
And just one final question. If you did have more notice about elections and you had a better timetable from your perspective for postal votes, would you be looking to recruit extra staff in the way that you do around Christmas seasonal work, or do you feel confident that the existing staff levels are able to cope with local and general elections?
I feel confident our existing, because the upstream part of our network, so not the final mile delivery part, but the upstream part of the network is highly automated. It doesn't have a significant impact on the resource required to process the volume through the network. We have agreements with the CWU that represent the postmen and postwomen to provide reward to postal workers for the job that they do, and they do a fantastic job. So we provide reward, if you want, for the additional workload in the final mile that is taken on. But you know, if we're still calling at 50% of addresses, and I'm using that, it's not far away, 50% of addresses every day anyway, going up those garden paths with another item of mail does not add any additional time into the delivery network.
You wouldn't be looking to have additional casuals, particularly in the delivery offices, to make sure that you were meeting your targets?
No,
thank you.
We'll foresee that at this stage.
Sam Cotton.
Thank you very much. So I just wanted to revisit the free post issue, which you started to mention before in terms of the election address. In my constituency, we did find that it was coming out very late, and I know a lot of colleagues around the area did likewise. So I mean, just about the week before the election, I was out delivering what was supposed to be the follow-up leaflet to the election address, and I was actually out at the same time as some Royal Mail operatives. Do you recognise that those were delivered quite late this time, and is it something you've looked into and have any reasoning behind why that was?
I can only say what I said earlier, that when we looked at the delivery performance of candidate mail, the 184 million items were delivered overwhelmingly within the timeframes that we were set. There is a set schedule of when they're meant to be delivered. There were individual candidates who contacted us and asked for us to look into that. But as I say, in the overwhelming majority of cases, items were delivered to the schedule. I'm sorry if in your particular case they were not in all parts. But I think if we just step back for a second and reflect, from the close of nominations to polling day, it's an incredibly tight timetable. And I can understand that it may be frustrating if things don't always go entirely to plan. But again, within the realms of what we are dealt by the timetable, I think our people did remarkably well.
Well, absolutely, and I mean, absolute credit to you for the work that was done. I mean, I know you're under a very tight timescale. But just to bring up another similar issue, there were some boundary issues. So a number of colleagues raised the wrong free posts being delivered in the wrong areas. Could you tell us a little bit more about whether that's something you're aware of?
I imagine, for clarification, these were items that were not addressed but were due for delivery to every household. That's right, yes. Yes. So again, you're absolutely right. I think it was something like 570 boundary changes. I can't remember the exact figure. It was a vast change. For reference, when a postie is out on delivery, primarily their items are obviously addressed, and it's clear that, if it's going to number 87, then that's the door it needs to be delivered to. When they're out on delivery, there's almost a sort of invisible boundary, and as I'm sure you know better than me from your own experience, sometimes the boundaries are not, shall we say, intuitive. They stop in the middle of a road on one side and yet on the other side carry on all the way through. So I can only apologise and again explain it as human error, that on occasions that happened. Now I am aware there were some limited occasions where we were given bundles of candidate literature and told it was to go to a particular postcode area, and I'm sure inadvertently we were given information that wasn't entirely accurate, and in that situation we can only deliver to the instruction we're given.
So when an election address is sent to you by a candidate, you rely on the candidate to tell you where it needs to go?
Their agent normally fills
right.
in the work plan.
Okay, that's interesting. Just something we can certainly take away and look at. But have you then done any work on sort of how you can learn from that experience of where the issues were, and sort of, is there any guidance you're looking at producing for agents in that case, or is there anything around those lines?
It's something we keep under constant review. It goes back to the point I made earlier. Elections are taking place all year round, and where we receive information, usually from the candidate's agent or from a member of the public saying, I've no idea why I've received this because I don't live in that constituency, then obviously we go back to the local delivery office and we seek better performance in the future.
Sure, I mean, just it's worth highlighting, I think, that election addresses are only an issue for general elections, so it might be less often that they come in terms of your constant feedback processes. Just very finally, earlier on you mentioned timescales and timelines for when you're expected to deliver the election addresses by. Can you let me know what those are?
Sorry, can you say that again?
What are the timescales for delivery of the election address? So by what date are you supposed to have delivered them?
You might remember
The addressed election product is within 3 days of receipt into our network and 7 days for unaddressed.
Okay, that's really helpful. That may be something I'll follow up with you about later. Thank you.
I've got, who have I got? I've got John, and then Lee has just caught my eye. So John first, and then Lee.
So Mr. Carlin just asked my question about what the timetable was for how long you had to get those communications delivered. My second follow-up question to that was, have those timetables changed since previous elections?
I think so.
I don't believe they have changed. No, I'm not aware of any change to certainly the 3 day and the 7 day specification hasn't changed. No.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In relation to border areas that you referred to being, a bit more complex, is there any preparation? So we'll probably have these boundaries now for a while. So in the run-up to the next general election, will your local delivery teams have a look at what the boundaries are and go, oh yeah, we've got a difficult area down here in the southeast of the constituency, we need to look at it? Or if MPs have got that experience of knowing that it was sent to the wrong constituency, should they contact their local offices so that at the appropriate time for the next general election, a briefing can be held with your local postman to make sure that they're not delivering in the wrong areas?
I think both your points are well made, and yes, of course. But the first thing I would say is that obviously it's greatly appreciated if in real time any such incidents are reported to us, and I genuinely believe that where we did receive information of that nature, we acted very quickly to put it right. But obviously I appreciate in the heat of the election campaign you haven't necessarily got the time to report everything to us. But yes, that is a very good point, and I think that goes in the bucket of constantly reviewing and learning from experience.
Thank you. Michelle.
Hi. Just a quick point before I do ask my question. Now, I'm not saying I've got the best postal service in the land in my constituency, but I might have, because we had minimal delay with regards to postal votes, and all of my literature, which was planned carefully, to be posted out so that when postal votes dropped, they had a letter prior to that, and polling day all worked like a treat, and I owe a lot to Royal Mail for actually be sitting here today, if I'm quite honest. So a bit of a different probably experience in my constituency, but notwithstanding what has been said elsewhere. And also, as a postal worker's daughter, I also understand the complexities of actually getting Royal Mail out, and it's not a simple process. And I just want to say how I fully support the fact that you're talking about those that are employed on permanent contracts with the Royal Mail take up that extra work and actually have an opportunity to earn additional money as well during those elections. And I've seen how that's worked from visiting Royal Mail for many years and chatting room with many postal workers as well that talk about it. So that's just a couple of things, but I just want to just go on to the fact that there is a process here of undergoing change of the ownership of Royal Mail, and I wanted to ask what effect this will have on the way Royal Mail approaches the role in the election systems in the future. Is there going to be much of a change, and how are you coping with that?
Well, firstly, thank you on behalf of the workforce for your kind comments about the work that they do, and I'm sure that they will appreciate that recognition for the efforts that they make. You asked about the future ownership of Royal Mail, which of course is one of the companies owned by IDS. That is a process that is still ongoing, and if shareholders give support to the change in ownership, then yes, it will be a change of ownership, but not a change of direction. I hope that the committee have seen from what Ricky and I have said today and from the letter that we submitted in advance, elections are in our DNA as an organisation. It is also something that we've done for very many years, and which I hope, despite some occurrences of performance that of course concern, that by and large people trust Royal Mail to deliver elections. I very much hope, and I know Ricky does too, that we'll continue to deliver those elections for many years to come, and we'll take on board any points that need to be so that we can continue to improve performance in the future.
Thank you.
Just before we leave this sort of arena, can I just sort of contextualise something and ask for your observations? I agree with quite a lot of what Mr. Lamont said. I know none of you will think I'm old enough, but I've been involved not always as a candidate in elections since 1992. And the election just gone was, I think, the one where we all sort of held our breath more, and things things almost seemed to happen more by luck than by design when it came to quite a lot of the delivery network. Our constituents have become far less patient because of the sort of click and collect mentality. So waiting for things to happen appears to be dropping out of our DNA. And elections work, David, you've heard me say this before, but elections work when people have got faith in the results. And a Rolls-Royce system is required at all times, arguably less so when you have a landslide result, because one or two results here or there, if there's delays in postal votes or election material, doesn't sway the result. But in a very closely fought election, it's absolutely pivotal. And the electorate have to have faith in the robustness of the result and the honesty of the result to accept either victory or defeat. By way of backdrop, we clearly have more political parties. More people are using postal voting. We have an ageing population, potential increase in the overall size of the franchise, and are sure to be on the uptick take-up of overseas voting. Printing is getting cheaper, so more bits of paper are likely to want to be delivered by more of those candidates to more of those voters. Your overall volumes, certainly in terms of letters, decline year on year. Profitability has to be a key thing, etc. The resilience going forward against that backdrop is what is, Mr. Gold, concerns me. All because it's been done well before, or we just about did it. There were one or two hiccups we've learned. We'll try not to replicate them. Doesn't mean that's going to be the same going forward. Against those changing backdrops, demand going up, the potential of service supply going down or being maintained and not increasing presents a challenge. And I particularly like some reference, if possible, either orally or in writing, between differentials in outcome between urban and rural constituencies. And I'd also like some information on how easy it is to fill vacancies between your urban operations and your rural. Certainly talking to people in my area, jobs are advertised quite a lot longer than it would be in the centre of Bristol, Southampton, Winchester, Manchester, wherever it may happen to be. And these are national elections where we have to presume some degree of parity for all of us, irrespective of what type of constituency we are seeking to represent.
There's a lot to unpick there, Chair, and thank you for inviting us to write to you, because I think that may allow us to set out in a bit more detail some of the answers to the points you made. Resilience does matter, and Royal Mail is very conscious of that. I think that everybody at Royal Mail will have been grateful that the Electoral Commission, in their report, reported something like 89% of people who voted by post felt that they had confidence in that system. Obviously, we want to raise that figure in the future for the part that we play. But you are right. I think there was about 20% of people registered to vote by post at that election, which is up from previous elections. Going into the election, we were very mindful that we were likely to receive a lot more postal vote volume than we had in the past, and indeed I know that the franchise was extended to more people overseas than at previous elections, although it is noted that I think only half actually registered to vote, and of those, I think only half again actually sent a postal vote back.
That's why I said I think there will be an uptick
exactly.
as the right to vote becomes more readily understood.
And I think that now people are more aware that they are entitled to vote overseas. In terms of recruitment, yes, it is an acknowledged issue for Royal Mail, as it is for many companies actually. And we live in an economy at the moment where employment is historically high, and therefore the availability of people to recruit is it's becoming tougher. Having said that, to a point made earlier, Royal Mail is a very good employer. I think that stands to scrutiny. We offer better terms and conditions than anybody in our sector. But having said that, we are competing with other sectors. And I'm sure that Ricky will want to say more about this, but there are parts of the country where it is really difficult to recruit. And that is irrespective of elections, that is year round. So resilience is something that we focus on every day. Where I would perhaps take issue with the premise of your question, though, Chair, is that for our part, we don't think it was luck that we managed to deliver the election to the standard that we did. I pay tribute to all of those people who were working on those contingency plans. We knew there would be an election. We didn't know it was going to be in July. But we knew there would be an election. We were ready for it. We made sure that our people were well briefed on what it is that was expected of them. I think to a large extent, actually, our people recognise day in, day out that what they do is important. But I think they really stepped up to the plate, actually. And I think that in many of the parts of the country I visited to look at how things were going, I saw some real evidence of people going above and beyond to make sure that they didn't just play their part, they really delivered. So on the broader points that you made, I think it may be helpful for us to write in a bit more detail, but I don't know, Ricky, if you want to say any more.
Do you think, is there an argument for government to give consideration to pausing and reversing this trend towards endemic postal votes? You, Mr. Gold, and I are old enough to know that there were very specific circumstances where you could request a postal vote. Now people just tick the box and they have a postal vote for everything, even if they are, at home, twiddling their thumbs, watching UK Gold, as they, and that's not a programme about you, by the way, with nothing else to do. If there is a resilience alarm bell to be rung, not immediately, but in the future, is that one way that government could address it, by trying to reduce postal voting and have more direct democracy, i.e. people just turning up and voting as we used to do?
Speaking for Royal Mail doesn't have an opinion on whether people should be encouraged to vote one way or another. For our part, our role is to deliver the postal votes that come through the network, and that will be our focus now and in the future. It is, of course, the first election where people were able to register online, I believe, to vote by post, and there was a significant uplift in the numbers. For our part, our consideration is making sure that however many come through, we're ready and able to deliver those in good order.
Okay. Just to briefly to overseas voting, you'll know that the Electoral Commission have highlighted some of them. We recognise your right to highlight a very small additional number of overseas voters put themselves on the register, and a smaller proportion of that which were qualified on the register actually then took part in the election itself. Do you have conversations with your overseas counterparts to try to distill down issues and problems? It's very tricky if you're trying to send a postal vote from Dorset to Brisbane and expect it back in the time frame.
We always reach out to our international partners when there's a general election, particularly where we've got a density of overseas voters. I think the bigger issue, if I may, and it's in our response, is the 19th of June is a last day to register for an overseas postal vote, the same as if you were to live in the UK. When our advertised transit times for a standard letter product to not Europe's 3 to 5 working days, but the rest of the world's 67 working days. So it gets exceptionally tight, and I think that we have ongoing monitoring of the performance in the international network. But
you might advocate for a differential.
But you could go two things. You could go for an earlier last date to register for a postal vote if you live overseas. If you live overseas, would make sense given the transit time in the international European and international networks, or some form of electronic distribution, hybrid solution for physical return of the postal vote. And I know, having listened to the previous evidence session, the Electoral Commission will look at overseas voting overall, but there's a number of options there. The most immediate is to move that date to an earlier date in the timetable to provide more transit time in the international networks.
And do you think that the global, because people turn up all over the globe, don't they? Do you think that the global postal network has that resilience to cope with the demands and pressures that our electoral law places on it?
We have faith in other postal authorities, but it may be useful to the committee to understand that not every other country has 6-day-a-week delivery, and the methodology for delivering in other parts of the world differs to the UK. So I think we come back to this point that for a postal vote pack to get from Dorset to Brisbane, there is just a simple fact that it's not being flown out for overnight delivery. It takes quite a long time, and for the voter to have confidence that their vote, once returned, is going to get back in time, we really do feel that the timetable needs to be looked at.
Mr. Dillon and then Mr. Lamont on this, please.
Yeah, so you said in your response there that you reach out to international partners where you've got a concentration of UK voters. Where do you source that data from to know which countries have got a concentration of UK voters?
Well, it's colleagues in our international team who do the reaching out, and I think it is sort of widely publicised that there are large numbers of British voters living in certain European countries and others around the world. As I say, there is a process by which they do the same with us, actually, when they've got elections and if they have overseas voters, or if there's a referendum, for example, we know what to look out for in our network. But again, even with all of that goodwill and partnership, it still takes a certain amount of time for items to get to and fro. And it's for that reason that we respectfully request that this issue be looked at.
It's just because we got some data, but only from 6 local authorities on return of postal votes from different countries. So the information we're being given as a committee is very limited. And if you look, for example, Australia has got a 6% return rate compared to France that had a 75% return rate. So you could argue it's more important to go and speak to the Australians to get that return rate up than it is to France, which naturally returns and obviously has closer proximity to the UK to get it back as well. But I was just wondering how your data allows you to have the most relevant conversations with the most relevant country.
Well, I go back to the point I made. I hope that from memory, talking to colleagues in the international team, they had conversations with France and Spain, but I'm sure they spoke to others as well. I don't necessarily know that we keep a register. I'm not sure such a thing exists, certainly not publicly, of where individuals live. But I seem to recall in the Electoral Commission's report they had a section on international voting, and I think, forgive me, I can't remember the statistics, but I think they did reference the performance of the number of people who took part.
But the data only comes from 6 local authorities.
I didn't realise that.
Yes, no, which I'm sure we can pick up in the second session. What I think might, not to be entirely exclusive on this, but if there's any way, Royal Mail, you can pull together some data on the responses to challenges from Commonwealth countries, where by definition a higher number of Brits will often go to settle, might be quite interesting for us to see.
Very happy to look into that for you.
Thank you. Excellent. Charlotte. Oh, forgive me. No, John. No.
A very quick question.
Yes.
Given that stranded American astronauts could still vote in the American election, do you think there's an argument for making overseas voting online?
I'm sure that's not necessarily in Royal Mail's remit, but I hear you.
There would be merit.
Delivered to space.
There would be merit?
I'm not really sure Royal Mail has a view on that. I can speak personally. It's very impressive.
On that headache.
It's very impressive if you can vote from space.
Yes.
I hope never to have the opportunity personally, but
very hard to canvass. Okay.
So I'm interested in resilience going forward, really. And if I understood what you said earlier, the number of letters going through your system has reduced from 20 billion a year to 6.7. You'll have changed your processes and your staffing accordingly. And then I think you also said that during the election there's 250 million items in that very short space of time. So it's what changes will you need to make, should we look at making, to make sure that going forward you're able to continue to cope with that significant uplift in demand over that very short, tight period?
I wouldn't understate 6.7 billion letters is still a lot. So we still have a very significant network of scale. We've seen the bulk of these substitution playing through into the letters market. Letters will continue to decline in the UK and globally. We expect that to be the case, but we will still, and under Royal Mail's proposal, the Ofcom we expect to shortly consult on, maintain a 6-day-a-week first-class service at standard tariff as part of the proposal that Royal Mail has made. And we still expect that for the foreseeable. And I hear the word of resilience. I don't expect there to be a resilience issue. We may need to flex the network a little bit more than we have done historically when it comes to what we expect on the final mile part of the network. The upstream part of the network's highly automated. Genuinely, I'm not worried about that element of the network. It is the final mile part of the network. and whether that's in dialogue with the CWU about how we make arrangements around the payment that we give to our final mile delivery postmen and postwomen, or other flexibility we bring in. I really do not see there being a resilience issue for the foreseeable future. And I quoted the fact we've done 5 general elections going from 20 billion to 6.7 billion without a resilience issue. And as I say, we've taken the bulk. There'll still be decline in letter volume. That's why we need the reform to the universal service. But we will still have a network of scale on our final mile that will be capable of absorbing the type of volumes we see coming through during elections.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Any other colleagues? Any questions for Royal Mail? Gentlemen, thank you. You've generated a bit of profit in the amount of letters you're going to have to send us with additional information. We will track its delivery time to see how timely it arrives. But can I, first of all, just through you, notwithstanding the issues and questions that we've raised, but thank all of your staff and teams who are, as I said at the start, a key cog in delivering elections in this country. So thank you very much indeed to all of them, and thank you for your time. We'll just pause for a moment or two whilst we change the choreography. I will say order, so the cameras can go off, and then we can bring in our next witnesses. As always, thank you.
Thank you.
Colleagues, welcome back. Our second session and second panel today, the Association of Electoral Administrators. Lovely to see you both again. We keep recycling each other, which is a very good sign. And let me just start from the outset by, as I hope you know, just all of our thanks for the work that you and all your teams across the local government family do. It's you and the Royal Mail really are the key pivots to delivering not just the mechanics of the election, but also the reliability, the robustness of the outcomes. So thank you again for that. Let me turn now, please, to Richard Baker to open the batting.
Thank you, Simon, and indeed can I echo my praise for all those officials who do so much work to ensure that elections are well managed and efficient. However, as you know, there were problems at the 24 general election in relation to postal voting, particularly in some parts of the United Kingdom and in Scotland. We had specific issues around postal voting, no doubt anticipated because the election took place during school holidays. But do you see these, what do you see were the problems overall regarding postal voting at the 2024 election?
I'll go on that. Postal vote itself, I'm not going to repeat what our colleagues from Royal Mail said earlier, the quantities. I mean, it was record numbers. It was up by over 1.5 million on the previous general election, so huge strain on the delivery. I think we almost take it back one stage. What's the challenge to delivering this election? We've mentioned the fact that there were the May elections. It was everywhere apart from Scotland and Northern Ireland, so it was across the board. And coming off the back of those elections, I think it's fair to say the feedback that we've had from our members is they getting to December, January, where we are now, they're only just getting over the whole of that period. They're punch drunk from the amount of pressure that they had to face during that time. It goes back to sort of timetabling issues, I think, a lot of it, and the fact we're reliant very much on a very small number of suppliers to feed into that system. If we take, this was truly a snap election. I think I was sat there having my lunch and nearly spat my sandwich out when I thought, oh, we're off, as far as that, because we're all planning, I think, rightly or wrongly, for an autumn poll. So a degree of pre-planning had gone into that. Conversations have been had at local level with printers to get into the Royal Mail plan that was mentioned earlier, things like that. And then suddenly the firing gun had gone and we were off and running. So that made it very challenging in terms of the timescales, and I'm sure we'll come back to timetables and the fact that we're talking literally 11 working days before the poll is when the final deadlines are for registration and postal voting and the likes, of quite constrained. But that does link into the supply capacity thing, and certainly the issues that were very well documented in Scotland were as a knock-on effect through that supply chain. Data had been provided, there were issues. To answer the contractual issue, it will be between the returning officer and the printer. But ultimately, putting contracts to one side, the postal votes needed to get into the system. So whatever was needed, and credit to Royal Mail and colleagues, certainly in Scotland, for managing to get those postal votes out. So the final point I make, just if Laura wants to add anything to it, is that there will always be challenges at any major poll, and certainly this time around, in a strange way, almost the issues that we're facing in Scotland and in other areas of the UK focused in on the fact that there are a lot of stresses within the system. It doesn't take a lot to knock down that pack of cards.
So, it does seem extraordinary that because a printer broke down, some people in Scotland were denied their votes. I absolutely, agree. Royal Mail did a great job of getting those packs out there, but some people had already gone. On the day of the election itself, some people in my constituency hadn't got their postal votes. It does seem, from a lay perspective on the other side of the election, that because a printer breaks down in Nottingham, people in Scotland are denied their vote.
I think it goes back to the point that the Chair made earlier. I first came into elections in 1988, so again I've seen that change in the actual system itself. Any failure of a postal vote to get to an individual is a failure within the system. That I think any electoral administrator will say exactly the same thing. We're there to help people do that. But ultimately what we've got in brutal reality is an 1872 set of legislation on which various things have been grafted onto that legislation. So the timescales that we're dealing with to correct where there is an error within the system is limited.
So do you think these were one-off problems, or given those timescale pressures, that they are likely to be repeated and to increase?
I think this is the first time we've had the high-level nature of the issue. I wouldn't say it's the first time the issues have been there, more on a localised basis. And again, the point being, at local elections, there may well have been issues that are not as well documented as they were at a parliamentary election. Now, there'll be various reasons for that. Some of them will be the administrator error, some will be printer error, some will be Royal Mail error. It's the way it works through that process. So in terms of are these things going away, as things stand, I would say no, because there is an inherent stress within the system that doesn't provide that, for want of a better phrase, the wiggle room to actually resolve where an issue has been identified through any failure within the system itself.
I think it is worth adding as well, for the first time at a general election, we had online applications for postal votes. So we saw over 1.2 million people apply for a postal vote once the election was called. That's a huge volume in a short space of time. But one of the key concerns that we have is that we have lost localised messaging. Previously at a general election, the election's called, someone phones up the local authority, I need a postal vote. Okay, if you get the postal vote back to us by this date, you'll be in our first run. If you get to it after this date, your postal vote won't be issued until the 19th of June, the 20th of June, which manages electors' expectations. So many people had gone on holiday because to them, they'd applied on the 22nd of May. We know lots of local authorities' first issue didn't go out until the 18th or 19th of June. to the electorate, that's a month that they have waited. They don't understand that nominations don't close until the 7th of June, so we can't print the ballot papers. But when they were applying via the local authority, that messaging was up front and centre, whereas now they're using a central government portal and everyone is posting on different dates with different data deadlines. It makes it much more difficult for the ERO to manage elector expectations.
So how do you ensure that there is consistency around voter expectation and information in terms of when people receive their postal votes and how the system will work in their area, but to have the same information across the country about this?
We've already started conversations with the government about what localised messaging there can be. Once an elector puts their postcode in, we know which local authority is running that poll for them, and we can get EROs and returning officers to give the government that messaging so that that can be passed on at the point of application. Because once someone has applied, it's then very difficult to say to them, actually, you've applied with this expectation, but really this isn't going to be managed by us. So we're really keen that now we've got a portal that works very well. The electorate are using the Register for Postal Vote portal. It's really good at the front end. We need to be looking at where we can enhance it.
We weren't immediately sure that it would be, were we?
At the front end, we were always pretty confident, Chair. The back end, I think, still could do with a little bit of work.
In terms of those longer term issues, we now have registration online for postal vote. We have more and more people seeking to vote by post. What do you think are the longer term challenges in terms of how we facilitate postal voting in the future?
I think, as Peter said, suppliers, we are having less and less suppliers. We've seen in the last 6 months, one major supplier has been bought out by another supplier. The amount of people that can do this work is decreasing and decreasing. We have seen companies leave the industry altogether because the deadlines for them to work to, suppliers are under as much pressure as electoral administrators. The printers have got to deliver in a smaller window. They don't even have 25 working days because we need to get these votes out. And that's our concern, is about the supplier market. And we see less and less small local printers delivering postal votes now. It's mainly the large printers, and therefore the resilience is reduced. And as we've seen every year, 9.5 million people were issued a postal vote this time. 26.2% of the electorate who voted by post. It's a huge number, and without doing something to do with deadlines, without looking at the requirements of the printers, we are going to struggle year on year.
I think just to add to that, I don't making the point that what occurred at quite high level in Scotland in July, running up to the July elections, that has happened before, but has not had the high-profile nature. So it does very much depend on the ability of suppliers, and they do a fantastic job of being able to react to situations. But I also take that back one stage further to say the very snap nature of the election, with the complexity of all the changes the Elections Act have brought in for the first time at a major national poll, put that pressure on everybody in the system as to almost on the back foot from day one to be able to react and deliver what ultimately was the safe poll that was delivered on in July.
A diminishing number of suppliers that can provide a service is an extremely structural problem which we're going to have to address. But I guess, how can we make it easier for both for suppliers and for administrators? As you'll see, electoral commissions come forward with a number of recommendations around the current deadlines for postal vote applications and more flexible rules for reissuing postal votes where there are problems. So, what do you think in terms of electoral commission's recommendations? Would they help address some of the challenges that we've seen?
In the main, we support everything the Commission said. In fact, we're about to, in February, we'll issue our blueprint for electoral reform, which we will obviously give to the committee. But the sort of things that we're talking about there, it's been mentioned earlier today, the deadline, bringing the actual postal voting deadline brought forwards away from the election slightly to build extra capacity into the system. We have asked for 16 days, but anything that moves away from the current deadline is sensible. What we also think is the ability for where things do go wrong to put the elector slightly more at the centre to be able to resolve it. The sort of things that are anomalies we believe in electoral law at the moment was again mentioned earlier by our colleagues from Royal Mail. The fact that you cannot reissue a lost or undelivered postal vote until 4 days before the poll. If you've delivered that 12 days ago, you're hamstrung because of that. at that stage, will a postal voter want to still vote by post, or can they change? Is there a system to change them to be able to either vote by proxy or to vote in person at the polling station? It will add a degree of complexity into the process, but it's something that needs to be considered in terms of the very and they are upsetting issues of individuals who've legitimately applied for their postal vote. It hasn't arrived; they've not been able to get that back, and certainly it's something that, you know, it's a system that can be changed. It just needs careful thought as to how do we make sure the postal voting system that we've got, that, as we say, is dealing with that many postal votes at the moment, is able to satisfactorily deliver, even under the most intense pressure as it was in last year's general election.
There are additional reforms you think can be made in addition to those already recommended by the Electoral Commission?
Yeah, and we've had, I think, principally they are very similar to the Commission's, but we're adding a little bit further on those sort of areas that we believe will add that flexibility in to address the voter.
Anything else?
Just question 15.
Yes, go ahead.
So finally, from me, thank you, Chair. What do you feel has been the experience of the electoral administrators with Royal Mail's role in the electoral system? We saw how Royal Mail took significant action to respond to the situation in Scotland, which now was praised by electoral management board for Scotland, but clearly it's across the UK there may be different experiences. Just to and reflects on the fact that initially in Scotland, the electoral management board suggested there were problems within Royal Mail. We've heard today that wasn't the case. So how do you feel, how resilient with Royal Mail in terms of their performance in election across the United Kingdom?
We will have many of our members say Royal Mail really helped us out. So in the situation that we had in Scotland, where the printer was late printing the packs, Royal Mail went above and beyond. But that doesn't mean that the same administrator might also find that a postman hasn't delivered a walk, and that we have streets and streets that haven't received their postal votes. We haven't touched really much on poll cards as well. So post votes are sent first class, and then that is the actual ballot paper going through someone's front door. It is vital that that gets to them. We probably see within the industry more complaints about poll cards, which that is the message that there is a poll when you have to apply for a postal vote by where your polling station is. They are delivered generally second class or through downstream access providers and things like that, and they take a little bit longer to get there. And again, that
second class or what?
Through downstream access. So they are a provider who then passes it on to Royal Mail to do the final leg of the journey. So it's not always that the printer or the local authority is directly contracting with Royal Mail. Sometimes there is another provider that's used in between the two.
Can you just give us an example of who that might be?
Someone like Whistle, I believe, is a downstream access provider. So someone like that can do it, and they're still doing a very good service. But again, where we're saying Royal Mail and their commitment on first class delivery, not every element of the electoral process is using that first class delivery. We are relying on second class, and if your poll card doesn't arrive for quite a long period of time, you're later applying for a postal vote because you didn't realise what the deadline was, and that knock-on impact that we can see.
Thank you. Richard, quickly.
Thank you very much. I'll start off with a thank you for the work you've done, especially on the Isle of Wight following PCC elections. I know elsewhere, back of May elections, and very, very small teams. And I don't just thank the Isle of Wight because of my result. I thank them for the genuine hard work they put in. I also think, and it isn't my job to defend, but I think there is a misunderstanding of how supply chains work, and that the assumption is that something goes wrong and you just go out to another supplier, and that isn't the case. And I think what we probably as a committee need to look at is the government's understanding and responsibility for this sort of thing, because democracy is critical. And I think partly a lack of a national industrial strategy may have part to play in that, but that's not for this committee. So in terms of the Electoral Commission said, that the election was well run. You probably covered quite a lot of this, but what would be your overall assessment of the election?
I think we echo that. It was well run. And I think that is testament to every part of that supply chain. Now, we will be, obviously, we're very keen to make it clear the amount of work and the electoral administrators went over and beyond. I made the point already, it was a punch-drunk feeling through the remainder of the year because the personal cost that put on who are reasonably junior staff in small teams, generally speaking. There's, I believe, a misconception that there's huge machineries in place to run elections. It's not. It's actually very, you will know this from your contact with your own local authorities, how small that is. There's pressure being brought on the elections delivery because local authorities are getting smaller. So if we talk about things like staff to assist, polling station staff, count staff, there aren't the numbers of bodies who are there readily available to understand the excitement of an election, quite frankly. So that's adding further challenge into these sorts of processes. But I think it is testament, and we've concentrated on some of the issues with postal voting, but overall, the story wasn't of a failing election administratively. It was, the story was the result. The story was, the Friday, the Saturday as it came out. But that doesn't take away from the fact that, ultimately it's a system that works, but it's a system that's creaking significantly. And I think we would argue as an association, works only because of that commitment of those who will go forwards. And long may that continue, but we have to rely on the officers, as you mentioned, who are able to have that expertise and the drive to keep continuing that forwards.
I mean, to be fair, you have stressed the point about the snap election. It's a bit like Dad coming home on Friday night and saying, let's have Sunday lunch tonight. And we might be able to cover it, but well done. How close would you say something was to going critically wrong in terms of, you're putting your hands up and saying this is going to fail, we're going to have huge amounts of votes that aren't delivered? Or
I think it would be that the thing with the parliamentary election is for it to go critically wrong would need it to go critically wrong in 650 constituencies. Unlike a local government election where the issue could have more of an effect on the actual outcome of the result itself. I think ultimately it comes down to, did the electorate trust the outcome? And even though there was the high-profile nature of the postal voting issue in Scotland, there were other issues locally that were being addressed and being reacted to. I'm not, even going through this process, I would say that we weren't in a position that the whole thing would fall down. Okay. But that doesn't, by saying that's more the nature of the type of poll that was taking place, rather than it being, there are lots of fundamental things within the system that make it more difficult to have that confidence that we can continue to deliver the outcome in the time that's available to us.
That is reassuring, and I know you've stressed the point about relying on good faith in a lot of cases. So without catastrophising, what would electoral failure to you look like?
I think we are sure that a lot of people in Scotland felt that they were failed by the system because they didn't get their postal vote in time. We know some candidates who their result wasn't declared until the Saturday, who weren't as thrilled as they could have been about, when results were declared and things like that. But to us and to our members, the issues that they have are largely based on volumes and supply. So, when we look at how many applications were received, so if we think about registering to vote and postal voting and voter authority certificates, we had almost 4.5 million separate applications for something from the time the election was called up until the deadlines. We've got some stats from Birmingham, the largest local authority in England. They had 58,000 applications received in that 3-week period. For them to suddenly staff up to deliver the level of service that they want to deliver. So if we think about overseas electors again, the franchise has been extended. We saw over 100,000 overseas people applying to register to vote, and we know that the service that was being delivered wasn't as straightforward as it could be. Sometimes that's because the person left the UK 50 years ago and they can't remember the exact address of where they were last registered, or that house has been knocked down and we've got to pinpoint on a map which constituency they now sit in, and those sorts of things. And sometimes it is just because a postie's had a day off and something hasn't got to someone before they went on holiday. But we are so reliant on suppliers, be that software systems, be that printers, be that Royal Mail. And even 25 years ago, we could issue postal votes sat at our desk in the local authority because, as the chair said earlier on, it used to be the case that you had to have a very good reason to have a postal vote. Whereas now elections are actually, in many ways, two elements. We run the postal voting and we run the poll, and they are very, very different. And when more than a quarter of people who vote are voting by post, We have to see them as two very separate projects.
I think just to, without trying to dramatise, again, going from my experience, you used to come out of an election saying we could have done that better, that was really good, whatever. Now I think the general feeling is we survived. And that is not a comfortable place to be with. Going back to delivering some training at the moment to returning officers ahead of potential elections or not in May, depending on other decisions being made. But there's a lot of focus on the theatre of the count. The count is what it's all about. Well, actually, lots of things can go wrong way before that if that hasn't been covered off correctly all the way through. So it's not that 6-week job. I'm very pleased to hear colleagues from Royal Mail saying elections aren't just once every 5 years. Yeah. There's a parish election taking place every single week. And that mustn't be forgotten in terms of any decision-making processes.
Listening to how you've explained it, it's almost like we've forgotten the human element. That we've assumed everything's automated, and the fact that actually we still rely on people doing lots of physical work.
And I think the key element of the automisation, I'm going to say the word, but the digital coming into processes is almost primarily, if not almost all of it, is to do with registration. It's not to do with the delivery of the election. It's still a piece of paper, stubby pencil, inside a booth or via post going forward. So a lot of the pressure that's been brought into the delivery of the elections is to do with registration challenges, butting up against deadlines, online absent voting, online registration. They're all absolutely welcome additions to the process, but it's the other side of that hard line that is still seeping in through to the process of delivering the election itself.
Thank you.
And as the Chair said earlier as well, about people's expectations of having things instantly. You can have your groceries delivered within an hour. It's taking 4 weeks for you to get your postal vote. People can't necessarily always understand that we've got very digital front end in terms of registration and applications, but then it goes down to putting a piece of paper into an envelope.
Yes, look, just before I move to the bottom, you mentioned the sort of conduct of account. And that of itself occasionally seems to be incredibly, I would say hit and miss, but very diverse across the constituencies. Certain things are allowed, counts are conducted in certain ways, so on and so forth. A lot depends upon the experience of the returning officer and their senior team. Would the process, speaking back to that requirement for sort of reliable robustness, would the process benefit from national, guidance might be too weak a word to use, but a national sort of modus operandi is how a count is conducted for national, I'm talking about national elections, not local.
I think, strangely enough, you'd be surprised to see in electoral law the element on the count says you count the votes. You verify, you mix, you sort, and you count. That's all it says. So that's why there will be differences. I think we would be reluctant to see that prescribed in legislation. I think it comes down to learning the good practice, because there are so many variables between different constituency counts. I used to work in North London, and we had 3 constituency counts and a huge leisure centre with a running track round the outside. So that's a completely different aspect to where I first counted in Watford, where it's very constrained. The principles need to be very clear, that ultimately you're talking about transparency, you're talking about other participants being able to see what's going on and being satisfied the papers are being sorted correctly. That does lend itself to differences, but we would fully support the sorts of things where the Commission is providing that guidance.
It does, but my point is, should it? We all sit here equally, whether we're a Member of Parliament, we've been here for a day or 30 years. It's a national parliament in which we sit. The rules apply for qualification for voting, how we vote, application for postal vote overseas, etc. There is, yes, best practice, but it's who harnesses it and who deploys it, so that all of us who sit here know that we've come here by precisely the same route, that somebody who drew a very large penis on a ballot paper, that wasn't counted because it started at one box and finished in the other, or whatever it may happen to be. And we've all seen them, let's be frank. And we've all argued with our returning officers about where it starts and where it ends and what that signifies and so on and so forth. Triggers for what will allow a recount? What are the criteria for a recount is very hit and miss. And I'm not persuaded I have to say, Mr. Stanyon, by the point that all constituencies are different. By definition, they are, but the rules are uniform.
The rules are uniform, but there will be different variations. And again, I can only give you the sort of advice I would give to a returning officer. On a recount, as a good example, is a request can be made by an agent for a recount. It needs to be justifiable. It needs to be something within the will it affect the outcome of the result? And to actually prescribe that is very difficult because the circumstances in each individual situation will vary. It will vary on the size of the count, it will vary on the staff that are in there, and it'd be very difficult to prescribe you shall have 50 counters if the venue doesn't allow for that and there are no other venues available. So it's more along the lines of the prescription, if there were any, is that this is the expectation. And I would argue that within the current rules, however limited they are, there is that expectation that the number of ballot papers issued has been verified and accounted for, has been agreed with the agents, comes out the other end, number counted, has been verified, and the result is as transparent as it should be. But there will be that variation. But that's not to say that every single count is perfect, because you'll see a difference between a Sunderland count, a Newcastle count, and somewhere in an urban area. Taking Cotswold, for example, where it could take 4 hours, 5 hours for the boxers to get in to a count venue. So there are lots of different variables that are in there.
You know, I'm not particularly persuaded on that point. But Mr. Lamont, and then I think Mr. Quigley wants to come
just
back.
very quick.
No, I wanted to let Mr. Lamont first.
Sorry.
I just want to continue the discussion about the counts. I mean, the Electoral Commission did confirm the election was well run, but they identified a few issues, postal votes in Scotland, and also a couple of problems at counts. One being in Wandsworth, I believe, and the missing votes in Putney. Several thousand votes went missing, which resulted in a revised result being issued. How common is that?
I wouldn't say it's particularly common. I'm aware of both the instances. I've spoken to both teams subsequent to the election, and they were both basically errors within spreadsheets that hadn't been identified before the count itself. I have to say, I am as certain as can certain be that will never occur again certainly in those two constituencies. And a lot of the lessons that are learned from these counts where the errors have taken place are picked up throughout the electoral community to say, oh, we do need to do those double, triple, quadruple checks going on. Part of that, again, you know, it sounds like it's an excuse, but the tight nature of elections, of this particular election, meant a lot of pressure was being put all the way through, and the count is at the end of that process. And I know for a fact that was a potential in that particular case. I'd also spin it around in some way to say the whole role at the count is every participant being involved. I had an incident many years ago where we came very close to declaring the wrong result because we'd put the wrong figure in the wrong column. But it was the agents picked that up. So they were able, as part of the provisional announcement of the result, so it's almost like what as an association we stress to our members is the agents have a role as well to be buying into that result itself. It's not just the RO making that decision. So, sorry.
I mean, the result did not change and wouldn't have changed, but the results in that area have been close in the past, so it could have done. I'm just wondering what additional training you're providing to your team across the country to ensure that whatever mistakes were made in Wandsworth are not made elsewhere again.
It's feeding through the fact that this happened, and again, it's a case of it's the thing. In that instance, there was a calculation error within the Excel spreadsheet. It's the lesson they've learned from that now is actually what we need to do is not have anybody in the elections team doing those final checks. It's somebody from the accounting team or somebody with that. So I think, unfortunately, where an error takes place. In both those instances, fortunately, it did not affect the actual outcome of the result. Otherwise, it would have been into petition territory. And we all want to avoid that. But the key point is then learning the lesson to make sure that doesn't happen again. And I know for a fact within London, within our London branch, that learning has been shared because of very similar natures of accounts that take place.
Okay. What I may add, if I may, is we also, for a parliamentary election, returning officers are required to start the counting of votes within 4 hours of the close of poll. It is the only election where that is a legal requirement. And tiredness is by no means an excuse, but I'm sure you all know from how hard you campaign during the election. Our members are working 10, 12-hour days for a month, generally speaking. they're making these key decisions at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, and whilst it's not an excuse, it's worthy of consideration.
An observation I would make, it's not a question, is that it's harder for us as candidates and agents to spot those mistakes when returning officers use mini counts as a method to make the or to count the votes, as opposed to having one big count where you can see the votes piling up. It's a very, very close result. If you have 4 or 5 mini counts happening, where you might be ahead in one pile and behind in another, it's very hard to make that judgment as to who actually has the most votes and who is ahead. But the mini count system, I'm not a fan of that. I think a one unified account is a much easier way for candidates and agents to ascertain what's going on, to spot these types of mistakes.
The Commission recommend mini counts, so where that is done, it's because of the Commission recommendation. But again, that each mini count result should be visible to candidates and agents who wish to see all of the aggregate parts.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley.
So very briefly, do you think the day of the week the elections are held on would make any difference positively or negatively?
I suppose in our blueprint we're recommending the whole thing gets looked at. I, for my sins, back in 1999, before the Commission came into being, ran a weekend poll in Watford, and please feel free to go back and see how successful or unsuccessful it wasn't. 8% drop in turnout was the outcome, but that's partly due, I think, to timings of on the back of close London elections that were just across the border. But there's a number of areas where we are entrenched in the way that we do things. Why do we do Thursdays? There's still some doubt, market day or other things that are the reasons why. It could be a solution, but I think it's something that needs to be carefully considered. Do we need a polling station in the way that we've got them now? Should there not be voting hubs with the expertise in more, early voting, things like that? Not to say that we recommend any of them, but it's something that is worthy of consideration, bearing in mind stresses on staffing polling stations, the stresses on the postal voting system that have been well documented. It's making it more of a suitable for the electorate that we deal with now. The more, as I say, you order your shopping and an hour later it comes. These are the sort of things that might be better addressed now. So, sorry, a long-winded answer to yes, you could, but at the same time, that I wouldn't jump to that decision tomorrow.
We polled our members recently on this question, and the majority supported exploring weekend voting because they think it could bring benefits in terms of staffing and turnout and venue availability. So schools, returning officers have the right to use schools. They're publicly funded buildings, but they don't like using them if it means that the school has to shut. Well, generally schools aren't open on a Sunday, so that would give you a pool of polling stations that are avoided at other times. And where we're seeing, particularly since COVID, more and more community buildings closing down or not wishing to be used as polling stations, we need to start thinking about alternatives to deliver democracy.
Okay.
Can we just pause there and just ask this general question, because you've come up with some questions, some thoughts, some observations. Royal Mail the same, the Electoral Commission ditto. The window between now and the next general election is a narrowing one, but we know it will be at some point during 2029. And if I was a betting man, I'd say on the same day as the local elections, but I wouldn't bet my last farthing on it. It makes sense at this very early stage, whilst the memory is fresh, does it not, for you, Royal Mail and the Commission to sit down and to work out this all went well, there's no problems here, nothing to see. These have got some real issues and we can only see them getting worse. These have got some issues, but this is how we think we solve them. This is what requires legislative change. This is what requires clarification. And then to present that back to government within the next 3 to 4 months as a combined trio to say we are effectively the 3 pillars that deliver this thing called a general election. These are our recommendations. So then the business managers can find time for SIs and so on and so forth. Otherwise, we will find ourselves not having all the learning, but making none of the changes which are clearly and demonstrably required in order to make it more resilient.
A lot of work's already going on along those lines with officials ahead of a potential elections bill in the next session or beyond, taking on point the limited time Parliament has available to make those. And a lot of what we call the legislative anomalies, the bits, the 4-day thing. And
does the 3 of you get together, convene yourselves, rather than having one traded off against the other, to come up with a uniform, won't be easy, but a uniform prospectus change in delivery?
We meet regularly with the Electoral Commission. We meet regularly with Royal Mail, but not as a triumvirate. I would go wider than that, and I'd involve organisations such as Solace for returning officers and the Election Management Board for Scotland, and in terms of understanding the range. And I think it's a very sensible thing to bring that together. Okay. Our blueprint will effectively do many of those
sensible but not done.
The pillars things. I think that. Yeah.
So the government do convene a supplier group, which includes us, the Electoral Commission, yes, Royal Mail, print suppliers, and they meet every 2 to 3 months. So yes, we've already had one debrief from the election, and there's another one coming up next month. And then each element does their own parts. But I think you're right that there is more to do as a group than there is as a separate.
Okay. And Colin.
Thanks very much. I had an interest in terms of the staffing of polling stations and other polling-related staff. So I think you mentioned that there's been a number of issues in terms of both recruitment and retention. I wonder if you could go into a bit more detail about that and tell us whether you think it might be a problem that's going to get worse or better as time goes on.
Yeah, so we have around 40,000 polling stations at UK parliamentary elections, so around 110, 120,000 people working in those polling stations, plus others who are supporting on the day. Recruitment has always been a problem. COVID made it worse. We've struggled much more since COVID to recruit people. We think there are several elements to this. So, as Peter mentioned earlier, a lot of the staff used to come from local authorities. Local authorities staffing is getting smaller. Local authority resources are shrinking. So we're having to look in other places to find those people. Polling day is 15 hours long. It's a very long day. If you have family commitments, if you have a job elsewhere, you might not be able to commit to 15 hours. And sometimes we try to have 2 shifts of people, but again, that's incredibly difficult. So again, that's where we think that there is merit in exploring other options for delivering polling station, where we could have more specialist people. You've got to think as well, these 40,000 presiding officers who are responsible, they've got, they could be in breach of official duty if they do things wrong and things like that. They do this job one day a year. We've identified over 40 separate forms that they have to understand in the polling station. They've got to understand 22 different types of ID. They've got to understand about the new post-vote handling requirements that came in 2024. It is an incredibly technically complex job. We're also seeing more and more people, they turn up without ID. It's a difficult conversation to have with someone that says, I'm sorry, I can't allow you to vote. It is becoming less and less attractive is the problem, which is where we think exploring long-term fundamental change and what benefits that could bring. So say, for example, we looked at some of the pilots that happened in Wales about voting hubs, where if you lived within the local authority area, you could go to the hub. You didn't have to go to the polling station in your village or in your polling district. So you could vote anywhere, you could vote early, they were using technology to enable that to all happen. And we just think the time has come to explore these options to offset some of the risks that we find. Because on polling day, invariably when something goes wrong, it is because a presiding officer has made a mistake. They have legitimately tried their best, but there is something that they have done that they probably shouldn't have done. They've allowed someone to vote who had a postal vote or whatever it might be. And they're very isolated incidents, but when you're relying on 40,000 people to do a highly technical job for a very, very long day once a year, you will see people struggling to do it and struggling to recruit people to do it.
And are there particular demographic patterns in the people that sort of do manage to do this job, and is that changing very much over time?
Yes, I think it's fair to say.
It's ageing, I think is the best way to describe that. But that's not to take away from the excellent work returning officers are trying to do to bring more people on the one end of the conveyor belt as other people fall off the other end, but it's definitely an ageing demographic without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah. People have seen it as a public duty in the past, and we have seen it's generally older people or retired people, but again I think COVID hasn't helped with that, where they've been more nervous about being in that sort of setting potentially, and then where they missed a couple of years they're not keen to come back in.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, one of the other things in my mind is in terms of the way we're seeking people to do these pieces of work. and whether the advertising mechanisms are appropriate. So if it's primarily an older demographic, I often see sort of adverts on social media all the time, and I wonder if that's perhaps the most effective way of doing it. Do you do much work to try and recruit younger people, particularly students maybe, who are looking for sort of odd jobs to do?
So we've seen our members do quite a lot of work with politics students and A-level students and things like that. I think one of the challenges that we sometimes find, though, is people think that it's a political job, and it's the opposite of a political job. You know, as election administrators, we always say we don't care who wins as long as they win by a lot, so we don't have to have a recount. Is always our preference. But yes, there certainly has been, and we've had a huge amount of help through TikTok and social influencers and things who've said contact your council. This is an opportunity to earn a little bit of money to be involved. We probably find more at the count people are wanting to do, because the count's quite exciting, whereas again polling day is a very long day.
I think it's partly changing the focus for returning officers as well for local authorities. Often they're quite difficult recruitment measures. You say you've got different routes in, but also going through the checks and everything. I think one of the challenges is actually to give the returning officer that reassurance that the person they know nothing about, they know something about somebody who works in finance or in resources or whatever the case may be, but where there's somebody they don't have that direct control over, bearing in mind if that person is the one who makes the mistake that ends up with the returning officer being before a judge explaining why it went wrong, it's a very nervous place to be. So it's not a simple solution, and the Electoral Commission did a lot of work alongside the stakeholders to work out how can we make sure that we've got the resilience built in down the line. But it's been tough for a long time, and it will continue to stay tough for the foreseeable.
Is it still legitimate to ask 2 or 3 people to turn up at a drafty village hall at probably about 6 o'clock in the morning to set up and stay there until about 10:30, 11 at night?
Yes.
It's still legitimate to ask them to do it?
That's the nature of the role. I think it's fair to say we talk about...
They could be relieved at lunchtime, could they not?
Again, and some authorities will do it. Some returns will do that. They will actually have and in fact, it's things such as, I wouldn't say a skeleton staff throughout the day, but you get to 5 o'clock and you add a couple of poll clerks because that's when the rush comes from people coming home from work, for example. There are lots of different ways it's done, but the primary method is you are effectively working a 16-hour day. The half hour before, the half presiding officer slightly longer, for example.
And HMG has always relied upon, if the alarm bell rings, deploying HMRC or DWP staff to come and augment.
They have done...
was that taken up last year?
It was not massively. It's not consistent across the UK. It's partly there will be pockets of where staff are. I think it was welcomed by those returning officers who took opportunity from it. But
well, there are two so the HMRC and the DWP is actually to help electoral registration officers process applications. So we talked about the nearly over 4.4 million applications. So the government have tried to have people that can process applications in the back office. They've also extended the offer to civil servants and those who work for the government to work in polling stations. But we find the uptake on that is very small because, to be honest, they have to take unpaid leave and it affects their pension. So we're not having very many people doing that.
Okay. Before we leave this question, I'm going to ask Charlotte Kane, and then we'll turn to Lee, Charlotte, and to Luke.
I was just picking up on the question the chairman asked about the long hours they work. Has any work been done to look at the safety element of that? Because certainly where I am, one of them then puts the ballot boxes in their car and drives sometimes quite a long on dark rural roads, having already been working for 16 hours. Is that safe?
Every returning officer is the employer. They are the employer. They've got that duty of care over every single employer that they've got. In some instances where there is that long drive, they'll go to hubs to be able to produce a few boxes, and then they'll be taken on to counts in very rural areas. But no, it's a very long day. It's as safe as it can be. It's a similar argument or similar point that's put about when do counts start, because the duty of care, you've got staff who've worked, people coming on duty at 10 o'clock in the evening, not leaving till 6 in the morning, then going home. Well, there's still that duty of care, but that also applies to candidates, agents, other attendees in terms of that. So that's a decision returning officers have to come to. So it's an area that's always, because of the responsibility as the employer, they have to be conscious of when it comes to employing in those sort of scenarios.
and it applies more widely to our members. The longest polling day I've ever done, I did 42 hours straight because we had parliamentary election combined with other polls, the local counts the next day. I did 42 hours without a break, and then I drove home. And I don't feel that I probably should have driven home at that point.
Nothing to do with the 3/4 of a bottle of gin you'd
well, that
yes.
might not have helped the chair. So, but,
only 3/4.
And at that count, I was back again within 8 hours
Yes.
because we had to count the parishes the next
Very
day.
serious point.
And we understand that everyone wants the results as quickly as possible. But say, for example, we started counting parliamentary at 9 o'clock on the Friday morning. Yes, we've delayed things, but actually they could be much more of a spectacle with television coverage and things like that than when people are staying up, seeing results being declared at sort of 4:30. I think we probably peak with the results.
Well, that's early for North Dorset. We never do it before 6. Mr. Dillon.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Wanted just to talk about some of the digital systems. The Electoral Commission identified that there was a problem with digital systems. In your letter to the Deputy Prime Minister on the 18th of July, you highlighted that as well. I'm conscious of time. I need to go myself after this question, Mr. Chairman. We've got a copy of your letter in our pack from the 18th of July. But how do you think the problems with digital systems could be addressed? And then a follow-up to that one is, should there be integrated sets of digital systems or a single digital system?
So just for background, for those who may not be aware, so we have electoral management software systems, and there are 4 suppliers of those currently across Great Britain at the moment. We also have, the government has set up, it's called an ERO portal. So with all the new digital infrastructure, it has now set up its own portal. Those systems talk to each other. I think it's possibly that they talk to each other in the same way as a divorced couple might talk to each other about custody of their children. That sometimes it's a little bit strained and doesn't work as well as you would hope it to. So we think that there is more work to do there. We have done some work with the government under a previous minister a few years ago about, should the government just set up one electoral management system themselves? The term eggs in one basket springs to mind a little bit, and we have seen, year on year, snags within certain systems where things don't quite go to plan. And we have to remember as well, there has been a huge amount of change within our industry, and what the management software has had to change substantially. So the government has done a huge amount of work on the portal. The portal is in a much better place than it was when it was launched, but it needed to be launched when it was because of other legislation that came in. We think there is a lot more to do, and we think the government working more with electoral management systems on that integration would benefit everybody. But throughout everything, we think one of the key things is communications and how we communicate with electors, how the front end, the government websites can work with the back end systems to update electors on every process. We now have a case with postal voting which we haven't explored, where previously you didn't have to have any identity verification to apply for a postal vote. Since the online system has come in, we have to verify your identity. If that check fails, we need to get that messaging to you. It's not a requirement to give us your phone number or your email address, but if you don't, then that again builds in a huge delay to things. So looking at the whole process from the elector's perspective as well, we think would be beneficial. But yes, we are very much reliant on the digital service working as it needs to.
And then a preference over not having a single system just because of the risk around that. Yeah.
Thank you. Charlotte Kane.
I think the question I was going to ask has been covered.
Thank you. Luke?
To just link that into the discussions we'd had last week on overseas voters and the lack of the system that's done for other countries where an individual is able to walk into the embassy, they're able to have their specific vote printed off because the systems are integrated, they're able to get the right paper for them and they're able to vote there and then, rather than having to rely on a postal vote to be sent or other complex arrangements. Is the system that you have at the moment able to offer that sort of functionality, or would that require a single system? or would an overseas module that links to specific borough or local authorities allow that functionality to be provided?
I think we're not the IT experts, but I would expect it would still need to be linked to the electoral management software systems, so the individual ones, because you're dealing with the 650 ballot papers that are going out. There's obviously something that could be explored around overseas constituencies, which may well resolve some of those challenges. But ultimately, the paper and pencil system that we've got is very safe in terms of you can recount it as many times as you want to, and there's an inherent mistrust of IT systems, or what that's for others to determine the safety of. Anything I think can be done, but it will need to be carefully worked through. If we retain a 650 MP system and it goes into consulates or embassies, who then takes responsibility for that ballot paper when it's in the consulate? Are they counting it? How do they get that back? Is it posted back? I think it's to be explored, but it needs to be carefully worked through what the implications are.
No, quite. But would you see there being an opportunity for people who are already civil service staff, diplomats, ambassadors being appointed as returning officers and able to preside over tabulation of, there's one vote for this constituency and this candidate, there's 3 for this guy, so therefore we can then communicate that to the relevant returning officers to add to a tally. And we spoke earlier then about there being quite different setups in different counts and exactly how that's done. There would be guidance that just said, look, there's these overseas electors that are voted in person at an embassy, and therefore they can be added to the total.
I think as a returning officer, I'd want to be satisfied that appointment has been made, that they are working on my behalf. So that's not to say it can't be done. It will be carefully worked through, because you've got 650 or 361, I think it is, returning officers doing the 650 constituencies. So it's not insurmountable, but it's just from a personal protection perspective, I need to be satisfied you are telling me the correct figures to add to my account. But that's not beyond the bounds of possibility. It just needs to be carefully worked through and not a knee-jerk reaction to the challenge that's currently there with overseas votes.
But we do think something, so again, to give you an interesting statistic, the overseas electors, so in Birmingham, 290 overseas electors asked for a postal vote after the 20th of June. So still within the deadline, but after the 20th of June, 290 asked for a postal vote, and that they were issued to them. 15 of them got back in time to be counted, 5%. Yeah. So if you look at postal votes returned, 80.7% of postal votes were returned across the board, but only 51.8% of overseas postal votes were returned in time.
Do you record how many were returned after?
Yes, the Electoral Commission would have those statistics. We don't have them, but they are entered up, if they're returned up to 8 days or something after the close of poll, it's recorded.
That wouldn't be specifically for overseas electors, that would be for all those that have arrived after 10 o'clock on polling day.
Although I believe Royal Mail have some statistics on the overseas figures, because they've mentioned in passing they had some, because they can see what comes back in on which different licences.
I think we saw what was successful. It'd be interesting what was unsuccessful and then hence had attempted to vote.
Yes, I think there is a gap in the data on overseas, which somebody needs to retrofill. Whether you want to take that on as a job, I don't know.
It's a job for the Commission.
It's more an Electoral Commission job, because they have access to ROs in a slightly different way than we would do, but we can contextualise it.
Thank you. Lauren.
Thank you. I've got a few questions on resilience, but first I'd just like to pick up on some of your comments earlier around the capacity issues with the printers. Have you had discussions with government around those concerns, and are you aware of any contingency measures being in place if there was a kind of catastrophic failure of a printer?
Yes, so we have had the conversations regularly with them. In fact, last week we knew another printer has been bought out, so we discussed that with the government then. It's fair to say that we have had a problem before, where the bank holiday weekend before the polls in, I believe, 2021, a printer said, I don't think we can get ballot papers to 20 returning officers, and that's with less than a week to go. So there was a lot of phone calls between the Commission, the government, us and other partners, and we looked at where in the sector there was capacity, what other printers could start doing, what resilience there was. It is incredibly difficult because most printers will say that they are working at capacity most of the time. So we were talking about, what is our worst case scenario? Well, our worst case scenario is you print it on your photocopier. So you print the ballot papers on your photocopier and you use a drawing pin to make the official mark on them, and we do things like that. But because the deadlines are so tight, and we have to remember that these printers print the poll cards, they print the postal votes, they print the ballot papers, so they have a very strict ordering of when they can do things, and there's very limited wiggle room for them to do it. But because they are so technical, particularly postal voting packs are so technical to print, and all of the numbers have to, on various elements, all have to match up and things, it's a high risk, and it's easy to Google some of the stories where it's gone wrong. It is very hard to get new people into the market.
Have there been any discussions about the government acting as sort of printer of last resort?
Yes, we did. 4 or 5 years ago, we did do a big piece of work with the government about what could be done for the printers. Can we start having some sort of charter mark or something where they are approved suppliers? But again, the industry is so small that our members, we don't like to say that the tail wags the dog, but we've talked about not printing within the contract. At the minute, you're very lucky to find a printer that has got the capacity to take you on, and often you have to agree to their print time frames and things like that because there is simply nowhere else to go.
I think there's a nervousness about moving because you're better than W&O in some respects going forward. A couple of years ago, there was a big issue with a printer where I think the worst case scenario was the ballot papers were delivered on the eve of the poll. They got very close. But it showed that in those sort of situations there was a multi-agency approach taken to and then farm out to others who had the capacity at that stage. So it's not the perfect scenario, but I think again it helped in terms of bringing it up the agenda for government to consider what can they pull as levers to help in this sort of this area.
And it's worth saying as well that a parliamentary election, actually, it's 650 different ballot papers. The bigger problems come when polls are combined. So as the chair said, if the poll is combined in 2029 with locals, particularly with parishes, we could be printing tens of thousands of different types of ballot paper. So you're printing 200 ballot papers with, 13 candidates on and things like that. And that's where it really puts pressure on the printers. A standalone parliamentary, the volumes are an issue, but the complexity is less of an issue.
Yeah, that's helpful to know, because I think we often think that it's very efficient in terms of costs and time to run them all at the same time, but actually there are other challenges that it poses that we need to consider, so that's helpful, thank you. We've talked a little bit about the various data systems, the kind of national ones and the more local ones. To what extent are you confident that there's sort of robust cyber defences for any interference in any of our elections?
I think from a national perspective, the national databases, National Crime Security Agency, they're all over, and the steps that local authorities have to go through to ensure they've got that linkage in a safe, secure way. We have to trust what the IT experts are saying in that way. There's an obligation on the local authorities as well to ensure they are as secure as they possibly can be. There have been instances recently of there being I wouldn't say data breaches, but issues with cybercrime, for example. Thankfully, it's been low level, minimal in terms of numbers. It is not minimal for the authorities concerned. But we have to rely on the expertise that is shared through central, local, and all the relevant policing and other agencies involved. So, as secure as we can be. I think the only thing, it goes back to a point I mentioned to Mr. Dillon earlier, was a piece of paper and a pencil in a polling station is a very secure system, because ultimately once you get to polling day you are reliant on IT to an extent, but not in the way you are 2 weeks prior to the poll where the real application deadlines are coming in and the like. So once you get to a polling station we can be reasonably assured it's difficult to affect an election unless it's humans actually affecting that.
The cyber risks and the data risks are much earlier in the process.
That's right, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. And just looking forward to the future challenges, particularly around resilience, What are your thoughts about how we can best deal with extending the franchise? So we know that the current government has a commitment to extend the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, and there's also a lot of change happening at the local authority level through devolution proposals. How are you sort of thinking about how you can address the challenges that might be posed to the system by those two changes in particular?
We think that there's some benefits in terms of the local government reorganisation in terms of getting votes at 16 through and things like that. So the biggest challenge that our members generally face is data. So we can see, attainers, 16 and 17-year-olds who are being enfranchised as soon as they turn 18, the number of attainers registered since the introduction of individual registration in 2015 has dropped off significantly. So previously, the head of household wrote down all of their children and they were registered without having to do anything themselves. Since there's been the onus on the individual, attainer numbers have massively dropped. Our members have been doing a lot of work to try to access schools data and other data within local authorities, which in unitary authorities is still a challenge. In two-tier authorities, it's a much bigger challenge because it's held by the county council and our members work at the districts and the boroughs. That's what we see as our biggest worry, is how we find these 14 and 15-year-olds to make sure we can get them registered so they can make the decision on whether they wish to vote or not, and access to data and improving voter registration across the board as well. You know, where we're seeing 2.8 million people register once the election's called, if we can get those people registered well in advance, that gives us a lot more capacity during the election timetable. So where can we start exploring national data sets to access more data? Where can we integrate government systems so that when you're telling the DVLA, for example, that you need to change the address on your driving licence, it says, oh, have you also re-registered to vote? We can do that for you if you just add in your national insurance number. Those sorts of things we think are vital to actually making a big impact on improving registration levels.
And I think the other factor, particularly around 16, Chair, in terms of the 16, 17-year-olds, is learning from what happened initially in Scotland and then what has happened more recently in Wales. What were the positives, what were the negatives? Because we've already been through this on a smaller scale, so it's learning from those sort of things. My apologies.
I was going to say, just the ability of one side to the other to share data and to trust how that data is going to be handled without taking ownership of it is often quite a challenge. I'm very keen to take Charlotte's question and Michelle's, but I am conscious of time. So, Charlotte.
Yes, the Elections Act introduced new requirements for accessibility. And so how do you think those operated in practice?
The new requirements were to open the net slightly wider, whereas prescribed previously, so it's now down to local knowledge effectively. I think in the main it worked reasonably well. I think there are certainly some instances where it hasn't worked as well, and there's a lot of, since the Elections Act came into being and been through the general election, we've seen the reports from RNIB and other bodies such as themselves. It's about now beginning to understand the challenges and the learning and what can be done realistically at a local level. I think, again, I wouldn't use the wrong word here, misconception. Electoral administrators will do all they can, but they don't know everything, so need to be advised as to what the best solutions may well be. Reasonable adjustment, what does that mean in some instances? It's trying to work out what is realistically possible within the resources available, and certainly what will be the effects that come out of making an adjustment in one station for one individual or generally across the board. So, if anything, I think the key element that's come out of the new provision within the Act and the learning from the elections that have taken place since is to keep building on that with the organisations who understand the challenges and needs more, to allow returning officers to begin to develop over time, because it's not immediate. This will be the solution. There are lots of things that will take a time to get to the best solution for the majority of electors, I think is the best way of saying it.
So you're saying you'll make the best reasonable adjustments you can, but there may be some individuals who will still struggle.
I think that in an extent is fair, because it comes down to the definition of reasonable adjustment. What is reasonable in terms of the circumstances? And it's the Equalities Act definition, isn't it? So
there's a good example where one person has been been on social media and things to talk about how this particular solution for blind and partially sighted people was brilliant for her. But that doesn't mean that that solution is the right solution for everyone who's blind and partially sighted. And then in terms of reasonableness, given the cost of that solution, would it be reasonable to put that in 40,000 polling stations? Or what we would think members would be better off doing is to actually start that dialogue with people on the sight loss register, for example, for this particular scenario, to say, is this the best solution for you, or would you prefer this? You know, this is the range of options we have available. Which one works for you? And that individual dialogue, because if someone's a wheelchair user, yes, you need a ramp and you need a wide doorway. But if someone's got other accessibility issues, you need to understand what is best for them and not assume that as a returning officer, you know the best solution and have put that in place. So it is that dialogue and that conversation with people.
So is there a mechanism in place where a disabled person would, you can go by a certain date to get your postal vote, where they know that they could go to their electoral registration officer and say, I have this issue, how are you going to support me with it?
Yeah, so on the poll card it does say if you have any accessibility needs, contact us for us to be able to discuss them for you. Where they're already known in advance, then people year on year can make sure that that solution is available for that particular electorate at their polling station. The challenge comes again though where we have a snap parliamentary election, the poll cards go out late, the elector contacts the returning officer 2 days before. There are limited options that can be explored with them then, but that learning needs to be built up over a period.
Thank you. In the interest of time, Michelle.
Thank you. Like the Electoral Commission, you've raised concerns about the rise in abuse, harassment and intimidation at this election. Could you outline how this affected electoral administrators and how does this compare to previous elections?
Very anecdotal at this stage. We're seeking evidence from our members in terms of the actual numbers, but I think it's slightly symptomatic of the ordered groceries, an hour later they come, is explaining the system that we work to. We have had it fed back from almost universally across local authorities that the core teams are taking a lot more verbal abuse, I think it's a fair word to use, in terms of the system is there for a reason to make sure it's structured, but the system sometimes doesn't fit modern life in that way. Overseas electors is a classic example where you can't justify sending a postal vote out, literally 6 days before a poll and expect it back, and yet that is to be, you can understand why electors will become irate in those areas. There wasn't, to our knowledge, a great deal of verbal abuse or physical problems at polling stations. I think there's a general understanding that they're following the rules that they have to follow. They are not the ones who make the rules. And that, I think, has been consistent from when it first came into being. I think there was only one case where a police authority were looking into something. So it's more around the fact that, and I think it's more fundamental across public service, is the expectations of, in this case, voters, does not necessarily marry with the ability of the system to deliver in that way, and in many instances for very, very good reasons, because that timetable is there for a reason, the deadline's there for a reason. So it's something that we feel we would like to see brought into the debate that the Speakers Committee is doing at the moment in terms of intimidation of candidates and elected representatives. But it would apply across, I think, most of public service in that way. So it's anecdotal, but it's growing. There's no two ways about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we better just draw it in. Unless, did you have a very...
I was going to come in on the point that I raised earlier in the private session.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, so it's tangentially related, I think, to Charlotte's question around political party tellers. So there's a lack of clarity, I think, around the guidance around what they can do, and there's a lack of awareness in general around what political party tellers do. Do you think presiding officers are in a space where they're able to manage the relationships there effectively, or are there problems there that might need some work?
There are problems there because tellers have got no standing in law. They're just people stood outside a polling station asking questions. The Commission has a tellers' do's and don'ts, and presiding officers will put those out to give some parameters. But being honest, if the police are called to a polling station, 99% of the time it's because of the tellers out the front are having words with each other. It's also very difficult to manage them in terms of when the electors complain that they feel that they're intimidating them accessing the polling station, because again they don't have that standing in law. You want to be able to engage with the political process and everything. So yeah, we do think that it's worthy of consideration to defining the role of tellers in law to be able to help tellers and those who are running the poll as well as the electors.
That's really helpful to hear, and I mean if you had specific thoughts on what that could look like, I'd certainly be interested to hear them.
Okay, thank you. We some questions which we haven't covered. Will you be happy to deal with those in writing?
Absolutely, yep.
That's very kind of you. It strikes me, as having heard now evidence from the Commission, Royal Mail and yourselves, do you think it's a fair sort of snapshot assessment to say we're at a bit of a crossroads here? Electoral law is multifaceted and complex, sedimentary in its build-up. Timetables are tight, demand goes up, resource shrinks and or is under pressure. And we seem to be at a crossroads between reliance on Peter used the phrase that David Cameron used, the reliance on the stubby pencil and the confidence that gives in the polling station, and investing in and trusting more digital and technology, because these problems are not going to go away, and every other business and most other services have found a solution in digital. That's almost the preordained destination.
In 25 years.
Because I love that stubby pencil.
No, it comes down, ultimately it comes down to trust in the system. Does the elector trust the result? And I have had experience working in GLA elections where it was electronic counting. It wasn't. It was optical vote recognition, and there was still a stubby pencil and a piece of paper to go back to had there been an issue. So over the last 25 years, it's been constant change. The whole of my career, half of my career, has been constant change. I think the issue is not so much about is there a preordained route down digital or is it to stay as we are. It's about almost taking a breath to actually work out what is it that is the next step, because the Elections Act brought in a huge raft of changes, as you know. They will bed in, become business as usual. Voter ID, I think, was the line that we used all the way through. It will become business as usual. So whether you agree with it or not, it will become what's expected. The crucial bit to this is actually making sure we don't knee-jerk into an area that causes more unintended consequences than it achieves the positives by going down a certain route. So I think we would welcome to see a full review of the way we deliver around voting hubs, around things that will make the system as much as it is today, but recognisable, but also maintain movement forwards. But a key point is we need to do that in a very structured, sensible, organic way, I think is probably the best way of describing it.
Thank you very much indeed for your time, for taking our questions. Colleagues, thank you for your time. A longer session than we had envisaged, but worthwhile and valuable, I hope, to our inquiry. Thank you all. Order.